Hi everyone, welcome back to our Bible study. I had to put on my sweater because it is freezing in this room. Hopefully I do not perish mid-Bible study. Today we are talking about 2 Samuel chapter 19, and there's, as always, a free PDF on our website, and check out the other links down in the description below. There's some interesting stuff down there. When did these events happen? We're still talking about the reign of King David, which would have spanned from about 1055 BC to 1015 BC. If you were with us for our last study, the characters are going to be mostly familiar, but we do have a couple new ones. First, we have David. Then we have Absalom. Now, Absalom was David's son who rebelled against him, but he was actually killed in the last chapter by Joab. Joab was a very seasoned warrior in David's army, one of his allies. He led a third of David's army against Absalom's forces, and they had the victory, as we talked about in chapter 18. Zadok and Abiathar, they were David's allies, and they were priests in Jerusalem. We'll talk about them a little bit. And then Shimei. Now, we talked about him a few chapters ago as David was fleeing from Jerusalem. You remember what he was up to? He was cursing David and throwing rocks at him. Well, he shows up again in this chapter. He was a relative of King Saul's. And then a guy named Barzillai. He's a very wealthy man who took care of David while he was kind of in exile in Mahanaim during the time that he had to run away from Absalom. Where do these events play out on the map? After fleeing from Jerusalem, running from Absalom, David went to Mahanaim, as we mentioned. It appears that he remained there until the men of Judah invited him back across the Jordan River to be reappointed as king after the death of Absalom. When David came back across the river, he came across around Gilgal, which you'll see on the map on the west side of the river, just north of Jericho. Now over to our outline. We're picking up the story after the battle between David's forces and Absalom's forces, the battle in which Absalom was killed. The first section deals with David's response to that battle, verses 1 through 8. Joab rebukes David for mourning for Absalom. So in 2 Samuel 18, that chapter ended with David crying about how Absalom had been killed, even though Absalom had tried to kill him and tried to take his throne. Well, when Joab heard that David was mourning instead of welcoming home his soldiers that had risked their lives for him, he confronted David and he rebuked him. And he reminded him that, these soldiers had fought, many of them had been killed to keep David on the throne, and yet David was boo-hooing about his enemies. So it was really an insult to his soldiers. Joab told David to go out and to encourage his soldiers because if he didn't, none of them were going to be loyal to him by the morning. Now, to David's credit, he heeded this admonition and he left his house and he went to the gate of the city and welcomed back the men who had fought for him. Section number 2 now, verses 9 through 15, David sends messengers to the men of Judah. So after Absalom was dead, the people of Israel disagreed about who they should appoint to be king. The men of Judah, who were David's own people, his own tribe, they hadn't really shown any speed or haste in calling David back over the Jordan River to be reappointed as king, maybe because many of them participated in Absalom's rebellion. Well, David sent messengers to them to encourage them, and he offered Amasa, who had been Absalom's commander, the job of being commander in his army in place of Joab. I guess David was still pretty mad at Joab. David's messengers took the message to the men of Judah. The message won over their hearts, and then they encouraged the king to return to Jerusalem, and they met him in Gilgal as he crossed the Jordan River. Section number 3, verses 16 through 40, a bunch of characters here. Shimei, Mephibosheth, and Barzillai. So when David and his entourage were coming back over the Jordan River, Shimei met him with 1,000 men from Benjamin. Now, he had a little bit different tone this time than he did when he was throwing rocks at David. Shimei begged David not to punish him for cursing him and for throwing rocks at him when he was fleeing from Absalom. Abishai, who had wanted to kill Shimei the first time, he asked David if he could kill Shimei this time. But David said no, no one was going to die on this particular day. David forgave Shimei, and he gave him his word that he wasn't going to put him to death. Then Mephibosheth approached David. You remember what happened with Mephibosheth? Mephibosheth's servant Ziba had come to David when David was fleeing, and he told David that Mephibosheth wanted to stay in Jerusalem because he thought that maybe the kingdom of Saul, who was his grandfather, was going to be returned to him. So Ziba made it appear as if Mephibosheth had kind of betrayed and turned his back on David in hopes of regaining some benefit from the kingdom. Well, here we find out that Ziba's story may not have been completely truthful. When David asked Mephibosheth why he hadn't gone with him, Mephibosheth told him that his servant had deceived him and slandered him. And himself being a lame man, being unable to walk, he wasn't able to go with David. So David came up with kind of a compromise. David gave half of Mephibosheth's land back to Mephibosheth, and he gave the other half to Ziba. Then David spoke to a guy named Barzillai. He was a very old man who had cared for David when he was in Mahanaim, and he invited him to come to Jerusalem. But Barzillai, he was very old. He chose, no, I want to remain and die in my own city. And so he sent his servant to Jerusalem instead. His servant's name was Chimham, and he went with David across the Jordan. Now, finally, verses 41 through 43, you can see that the outline barely fit on this page. This last section, a dispute between the men of Judah and the men of Israel, and this is going to continue over into the next chapter. The men of Israel were really angry that the men of Judah had brought David over the Jordan River without inviting them to participate in that process. And so there was an argument that ensued and fierce words were exchanged. And as I mentioned, that'll pick up in the next chapter. It's kind of a weird place to break the chapter, but oh well, that's what we get. Let's finish up with our application. Nepotism is a quick way to lose people's respect. David's choice to weep for Absalom instead of honoring the soldiers who had bravely fought for him almost cost him the loyalty of all of his men. Joab told him as much in verse 6. I think one modern application is that when leaders give grace and honor to their own relatives and then exhibit harshness and unappreciation towards others, they're going to lose people's respect pretty quickly. We need to be careful about this in our churches as well. Elders who shepherd congregations, they're going to quickly discredit themselves if they freely rebuke other people, other people's family members, people who aren't related to them, but then they turn a blind eye to the sins of their own families. Definitely seen this happen a couple times in churches, and it's a good way to create cracks of disunity in a congregation and for people to begin to lose respect for the shepherds who are supposed to be watching over them.